The name on the divorce papers was the name she had never chosen. Tina Turner. 2 words, 11 letters, invented in a car by a man who had not asked whether she wanted them. She had been carrying those words for 20 years by the time she sat in a Los Angeles courtroom in 1978 and watched a judge read them aloud in the flat procedural voice of someone for whom names are only identifiers, not histories. The courtroom was on the 4th floor of the Stanley Mosque Courthouse on Hill Street, a building that processed the endings of marriages with the same bureaucratic efficiency it processed everything else. Impersonally, by number, in rooms that smelled of recycled air and old paper. Tina sat at the petitioner's table with her attorney and kept her hands folded in her lap and looked at the wall behind the judge's bench. The case had been uncontested, which meant Ike had not appeared. She was the only one of them in the room, which was its own kind of statement about what the marriage had been and what leaving it had cost. The proceedings were brief. 22 years of a life, 16 as Ike Turner's partner, 20 years of stages and recordings and survival, reduced to 40 minutes of legal language. The judge read the terms of the settlement without inflection. The assets were listed. The cars, the properties, the royalties, item by item, the accounting of what 2 decades of work had produced and who would keep it. Almost all of it went to Ike. The Volkswagen was hers. The house with the mortgage was hers. The debt was hers. Then the judge reached the name. He asked, in the same flat voice he had used for the cars and the properties, whether she wished to retain the professional name Tina Turner, noting for the record that the name had been registered and was legally the property of Ike Turner. He looked up from the papers when he said this, briefly, the way judges look up when they expect an answer rather than a signature. Tina said yes. She said it without hesitating, and the judge noted it in the record, and the proceeding moved on, and 40 minutes after it had started, it was over. She walked out of the Stanley Mosque Courthouse on Hill Street into the Los Angeles afternoon and stood on the sidewalk. The city moved around her the way cities move, without acknowledgement, without pause. A woman in her late 30s in good clothes standing outside a courthouse was not a notable thing in Los Angeles in 1978. Nobody on that sidewalk knew that the woman standing there had just ended 20 years of her life in 40 minutes of flat procedural language. Nobody knew about the Volkswagen or the mortgage or the name. Her attorney said something practical and professional, the kind of thing attorneys say on sidewalks after proceedings. And Tina nodded, and they got into a cab, and the courthouse receded behind them. She had gone in with a Volkswagen, a mortgage, and a name. She had come out with the same things. The accounting, from the outside, looked like a loss. She knew it was not. She would explain this later in interviews, in memoirs, in the careful retrospective language of someone who has had decades to understand a decision that was made in a moment. She said she had earned the name, that whatever Ike had built around it, whatever legal structure had been constructed to make it his, she had filled it with her own work and her own suffering and her own survival. And she was not going to walk away from a courtroom with less than she had walked in with. She was keeping the name because the name was the one thing in the accounting of 20 years that she could argue was as much hers as his. What she did not say in the interviews, or not directly, was what the name had cost her. Anna Mae Bullock was born in Nutbush, Tennessee on November 26, 1939. Nutbush is a small place, a crossroads community in Haywood County, more a named location than a town. The kind of place that appears on maps, but not in the imagination of anyone who hasn't been there. She was the younger of 2 daughters in a family that was, from early on, not quite intact. Her parents' marriage was difficult and eventually absent, and she grew up in the particular way of children whose home situation requires them to become self-sufficient before they are old enough to understand that this is what they are doing. She was not a quiet child. She sang in church from the time she was small, and the voice was there from the beginning. The same voice that would one day fill arenas, present even then in the small wooden church in Nutbush, carrying further than voices in that room usually carried. She played baseball with the boys because she was faster than most of them and saw no reason to pretend otherwise. She was loud in the particular way of a person who has learned that being heard requires effort and has decided, at a young age and without much deliberation, to make the effort consistently. The name Anna Mae Bullock was the name that contained all of this. The church singing, and the baseball fields, and the small town, and the family that was complicated, and the girl who had decided early that the world was a place she intended to meet fully. It was the name her mother had given her, which meant it was connected to a loss. Her mother left when Tina was still young, and the name was a piece of the person who had gone. It was, in every way that a name can be a person's own, hers. She was 17 years old when she walked into the Club Manhattan in East St. Louis and saw Ike Turner for the first time. She was 19 when she first sang with his band. She was 20 when the record came out, A Fool in Love, the record that was supposed to be a placeholder, a guide vocal, a temporary thing. And Ike came home from the record company and told her it was being released, and her name was on it, and her name was Tina Turner. She said, "Who is Tina Turner?" He said, "You are." She repeated it a few times in the days that followed, the way you repeat a word in a foreign language that you were trying to learn. Carefully, with attention to the sounds, waiting for the moment when the sounds start to feel natural. Tina Turner. The T's were hard, the sounds percussive in a way that her own name was not. Anna Mae was soft, open, the vowels wide in the southern way of names that have been spoken in warm rooms for generations. Tina Turner was closed, clipped, the name of someone more certain than she felt at 20 years old, sitting in a room trying to understand who she had just become. She tried it in front of mirrors, she wrote it on paper, she signed it on things, forms, autographs, the backs of photographs, and watched the signature take shape, the two T's like pillars with her life strung between them. She listened for what the name told her about who she was supposed to be, and found that it told her very little, because it had been invented by someone else to serve someone else's purposes, and the person it described was not yet a person she recognized. The person she recognized was Anna Mae Bullock from Nutbush, Tennessee. That person had opinions and a voice and a way of moving through the world that was particular to her. That person had survived a childhood that required surviving, and come out the other side with her essential self more or less intact, which is not a small thing. That person was funny and direct and afraid of some things, and not afraid of others in the specific ratio that is a person's character. Tina Turner was a marquee, a billing, a name that Ike had constructed for reasons that had everything to do with how a name sounds on a record label, and very little to do with the human being who was being asked to answer to it. She answered to it anyway. She answered to it for 20 years, across hundreds of stages and dozens of countries and thousands of performances. Every night she walked onto a stage and became the name, and every night the name became a little more her. This was not a conscious strategy. It was what happens when a person inhabits something fully and without reservation, even a thing they did not choose. The thing begins to take the shape of the person inside it. In the process, she did something she could not have anticipated at 20, which was that she filled it. She filled the name with the voice that was unlike anyone else's voice, the movement that Little Richard said you could not compete with, the quality of presence on a stage that made rooms full of strangers feel that something was happening to them personally. She filled Tina Turner with Anna Mae Bullock until the name and the person were not separable, until the name invented to serve someone else had become, through sheer accumulation of her own self, the most accurate description of who she was. This did not happen quickly. It did not happen cleanly. There were years, many of them in the middle of the worst years with Ike, when she understood herself to be caught between two versions of a person, neither of which she fully inhabited. On stage, she was Tina Turner completely. The name and the performance fused into something that functioned without question. The audience saw Tina. The band played for Tina. The lights were aimed at Tina. And for the duration of the performance, Tina was entirely real as anything in the building, more real than most things. Offstage, in the rooms and the cars and the silence after the shows, she was not quite either name. She was something in between. The person who had been Anna Mae and had become Tina and was still, somewhere underneath the performance, trying to understand what those two people owed each other. Whether Anna Mae had been replaced or only renamed. Whether the girl from Nutbush was still present inside the woman whose name was on the marquee, or whether 20 years of answering to someone else's invention had changed her in ways she could not yet see clearly from the inside. She thought about this during the chanting. Every morning in the years with Ike, she got up before him and said the Buddhist words that a friend had introduced her to in the late 1960s, The words that gave her a room of her own inside a life that had very few rooms of its own. And in that quiet, before the day began its damage, she sometimes thought about names. About what it means to answer to a word that someone else chose for you. About whether the choosing matters as much as the answering. About whether a name can become yours, not through birth or legal document, but through the weight of everything you have done inside it. She did not resolve this question during the chanting, but she stayed with it. And what she came to, slowly, over years of staying with it, was something like this. The name had been taken from her, but the person inside the name had not. Anna Mae Bullock had not gone anywhere. She had been present on every stage, in every recording studio, in every room where Tina Turner had stood and given the performance that audiences remembered. The name had changed. The person had not changed in the way that mattered. When she left Dallas in 1976 with 36 cents and a torn dress and no plan, she left as Tina Turner. That was the name on the hotel records and the airline ticket and the credit cards that Ike had canceled before she landed in Los Angeles. That was the name the industry knew, the name the press used, the name her manager would eventually put on a new record deal. But the person who crossed the freeway that night was not a marquee. She was a woman in a torn dress making a calculation in a Dallas parking lot at 2 in the morning. Calculating whether the nothing on the other side of the door was survivable, whether the version of herself that existed outside of Ike Turner's definition of her was a version that could stand on its own. That calculation was not made by a name. It was made by the person who had been Anna Mae Bullock in Nutbush, Tennessee, who had learned self-sufficiency before she had language for it, who had decided early and without much deliberation that the world was a place she intended to meet fully. She crossed the freeway. She kept walking. The name on the motel register she signed that night was Tina Turner. The person who signed it was Anna Mae Bullock, finally, after 20 years, going in the direction she chose. In Los Angeles, in the years after the divorce, she had to rebuild everything. The career, the finances, the daily structure of a life that had been organized entirely around another person's needs and had to be reorganized around her own. She took the work without complaint and without the kind of bitterness that would have been understandable. She got up every morning and chanted and went to work and did not spend energy on the gap between where she was and where she had been. Part of that work was the name. She had kept it in the courtroom without hesitating, but keeping it and owning it were different things, and she knew the difference. The years after the divorce were partly the years of making the name fully hers. Not Ike's invention carried forward, but her own achievement accumulated, the name that would mean what it meant because of what she had built inside it. Private Dancer came out in 1984. What's Love Got to Do with It went to #1. The Grammy stage, the arena tours, the generation of listeners who knew her only as what she was, a solo artist, a voice unlike other voices, a woman in her mid-40s doing something that most artists half her age could not do. All of it under the name that Ike had invented in a car in 1958, and a judge had noted in a record in 1978, and she had taken out of a courtroom and made entirely her own. She moved to Switzerland and became a citizen. She married Irvin Bach and said it was her first real marriage, the first entered as a full person with full choices. In Zurich, in the house by the lake, she was Tina. Not the trademark, not the legal entity fought over in courtrooms. Tina. The name a girl from Nutbush had been given without asking, and had spent 60 years making the truest description of herself she had. Anna Mae Bullock had been born in Nutbush, Tennessee in 1939. The name was Tina Turner. She had not chosen it. It was hers anyway, in the way that matters most. Not because someone gave it to her, but because she had given it everything she had, and it had held. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe for more stories about the human beings behind the music, the part that doesn't fit on a marquee, the part that happened before the name meant what it means. And if you've ever had to make something your own that wasn't given to you freely, tell us about it in the comments. Hit the notification bell so you never miss one of these stories.